Hello, I'm Jamie Claiborne, a doctoral student in higher education leadership at Bethel University. In this presentation, I will describe a major landscape change in higher ed, the recognition of equity gaps. I will briefly explain how the equity reckoning is and should continue to lead major shifts in processes and policies, including in admissions and academic placement practices. I will also highlight the leadership approaches and implications for this shift. Whether measured by retention, persistence, and graduation rates, or by student satisfaction and graduation outcomes, the data-driven student success movement has become pervasive in contemporary higher ed. That movement, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic, have shown a bright light on post-secondary education inequities. Traditionally underserved student populations do not have the same access to a college education, and those who do enter face structures that inhibit success. A 2016 report titled Advancing Diversity and Inclusion in Higher Education, commissioned by the U.S. Department of Education that focused on race and ethnicity, concluded that, quote, the participation of underrepresented students of color decreases at multiple points across the higher education pipeline, including at application, admission, enrollment, persistence, and completion. The researchers also noted that while equity gaps have closed at the high school level, they have increased at the college level. The authors noted that, quote, the gap in bachelor's degree attainment has steadily widened between Hispanic and whites as well as Black and white U.S. residents in the 30 years between 1974 and 2014. Indeed, according to the National Center for Educational Statistics' most recent data on graduation rates, while the 6-year graduation rate for white students is 64%, for Hispanic and Latinx students it's only 54%. And for Black students, only 40%. A similar pattern exists for low and moderate income students, often measured by eligibility for federal Pell Grants. A 2015 study by the Educational Trust revealed that there was a significant gap between Pell and non-Pell students in attaining bachelor's degrees. Non-Pell 6-year graduation rates were 65%, but Pell graduation rates were nearly 15 percentage points lower at 51%. In more recent reporting by The Third Way, in 2018, graduation rates for first-time, full-time Pell students at four-year institutions were down to 49%. While graduation rates are but one of many ways to measure equity gaps in higher education, they provide clear evidence of disparities and ones that must be addressed if higher education is to achieve its public mission. This is especially true as the overall and especially as the college-going population in the U.S. diversifies. As shown in these two graphs, one from the Pew Research Center and one from the National Center for Education Statistics, the number of white students has and will continue to decrease, while the students of other races and ethnicities, especially Hispanic and Latinx students, are and will continue to grow. As Reynolds and White put it when writing about the future of Christian higher education, quote, it is incumbent upon institutions to provide the student support services and the learning environment that will enable underserved students to thrive, fulfilling their individual potential as well as contributing to the public good. This presentation focuses on one of those support and learning environment structures, the measurement of college readiness and the placement of students in courses to begin their college journey. Historically, most colleges and universities in the U.S. have relied on a single measure, often a score from a standardized exam or a placement test, to place students into their foundational courses in math and English. The practice of using scores to assess, judge, and place students has roots reaching back to the founding of the modern American university in the early 19th century. Adapted from industry, where quantifiable measures of productivity were being developed, grading and testing systems also have discriminatory and prejudicial roots in eugenics, bias, and quite frankly in race, gender, and socioeconomic injustice. As early as the 20th century, educators were pushing back on the practice of reducing students, including all their abilities, dispositions, and potential, into a single score. In 1913, educator I.E. Finkelstein critiqued the practice, arguing that scores were not only reductive, but that they were misleading, being sold as objective and scientific and yet utterly ineffective at measuring something as complex as the learning process. He also said they were decidedly inequitable. Yet, over a century later, the practice of using single measure placement still persists. The practice is also reflective of a long-standing deficit culture and deficit-minded structure in higher ed. According to higher ed scholar Tia Brown McNair, quote, deficit-minded thinking involves blaming the student for being underprepared rather than blaming the social systems that perpetuate inequities in education. It involves the belief that certain students cannot learn how to navigate the complexities of higher education and that they are unmotivated or that they lack the intellectual capacity to succeed. The deficit perspective seeps into nearly every aspect of the academic enterprise, including into placement. As Davidson pointing out, in the deficit model, poor scores are a problem of the learner, not of the instructor or the institution. Add to this a long history of differences in standardized test scores among racial and income level groups that have been well documented in research and the legal system, and the fact that academicians and sociologists have argued for years that the tests themselves are both culturally biased and form a barrier to entry for students, and we have the makings of a major landscape change for the industry. While test makers like the College Board have undertaken revisions in recent decades to reduce bias and shrink gaps, higher education itself has begun to pivot away from scores in admissions processes. While some of this had begun prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the lack of student access to testing during nationwide shutdowns accelerated the adoption of test optional policies, at least temporarily, by over 1,400 colleges and universities. Many institutions that were forced to go test optional during the pandemic plan to continue that process for at least one more year. And a recent survey of enrollment officers, most respondents said that they are unlikely to return to test-required admissions in the next 3 to 5 years. They did note that the data from the next few years will be critical to understanding whether test optional policies are tenable in the long run. However, there is some data already in. Take, for example, Hampshire College, which in 2014 went not test optional, but test blind, meaning test scores are not even considered in the admissions process. Hampshire uses a more holistic admissions process, and the results have been a 21% increase in the diversity of the student body, a 4% increase in yield, and the institution remains ranked in the top 1% of colleges for students placed in doctoral programs, with more than 50% of their students going on to earn some kind of graduate degree. Likewise, a 2-year study on test optional placement in George Washington University revealed that students who got in with high test scores performed no better as freshmen and sophomores than those who got in without submitting their test scores at all. Of course, a lack of test scores in admissions during the pandemic also meant a lack of test scores for placement in English and math courses. This forced another acceleration in the use of alternative processes. While some institutions flocked to online standardized assessments to do placements, others engaged in more reform work, given that compelling research on the limits of single instrument placement has existed for many years. Alternatives included everything from low-stakes adaptive assessments to the use of high school grades and GPAs to guided self-placement initiatives. But the most common best practice emerging is the use of multiple measures, not a single measure, to determine placements. Not only have studies shown that using multiple measures often results in fewer students being placed in remedial classes, but localized studies at particular institutions are also revealing greater positive outcomes in everything from performance in the initial non-remedial course, to performance in subsequent courses, to overall graduation rates, especially for traditionally underserved student populations. The evidence is so compelling that several statewide community college systems now mandate multiple measure placements. Research out of the Public Policy Institute of California makes clear that underplacement and subsequent remediation is an equity and social justice issue. They found that many students were not only being underplaced by one level, but often by 2 or more. And, quote, a large number of students never took or completed a college level course when a single placement exam put them in a traditional remedial course. They had already dropped out of college altogether before they even got to college level courses. Underplacement that leads to unnecessary remediation is not merely an inconvenience for students. It has ethical and pervasive social justice ramifications. Reform advocates have deemed it a major roadblock to student success, resulting in lower retention and completion rates and higher costs for students because of increased time to degree. It also delays or locks out traditionally underserved students from upper division courses and from specialized high-demand programs in high-paying career fields, especially STEM fields. These denials perpetuate cycles of inequality, underrepresentation, and wealth gaps. In fact, in the previously mentioned Advancing Diversity and Inclusion in Higher Education report, they recommended reforming placement strategies in order to mitigate the time students spend in remedial education without making progress toward a credential. They also noted that, quote, although half of all undergraduates take at least one developmental course, research indicates that many of the tests are poor predictors of success in college-level courses and may not be a good use of students' or institutions' time and money. Solving the equity issues in the placement practices in higher education is not a simple problem with a known and off-the-shelf solution. It is, instead, an adaptive problem and a transformational leadership opportunity. Dumestra differentiates between transactional and transformational leadership, and Heifetz, Grashow, and Linsky do the same for technical versus adaptive leadership. According to Dumestra, transactional leaders work within existing systems and within traditional boundaries, and while they do activate change, they do so incrementally and within current parameters. Heifetz and his colleagues use similar language when discussing leaders who use technical approaches, which allow them to deploy systems, processes, and expert authorities that already exist within an organization. The problem is that many issues in contemporary higher education, and certainly the issue of equity, require substantially more than technical or transactional approaches. Indeed, the issue of equity calls into question long-standing systems, processes, structures, and cultures, and is therefore a fundamentally adaptive problem for higher education leaders. Many leaders default to technical approaches because adaptive or transformational leadership is difficult. It's time-consuming, and it requires a leader to resist the pressure to conform to the status quo and the inertia of traditionalism. According to Heifetz, the single biggest failure of leadership in higher education is to treat adaptive challenges like technical problems. He and his colleagues describe adaptive problems as one that require learning and change, discovery and experimentation, and that cannot be readily resolved by a directive from above. Likewise, Dumestra noted that in higher education, at this critical moment, transformational leaders are needed to enact change. He describes transformational leadership as dealing with values such as justice, equality, and human dignity, and that the goal is for both leaders and followers to move to a higher level of morality. The placement equity issue is an adaptive problem that requires transformational and adaptive approaches. Dumestra describes transformational leaders as those who build community and create shared understanding of the institution's mission. They articulate a clear purpose and direction for their universities. They foster creativity and innovation through cross-institutional groups, and they break down traditional structural barriers to collaboration. They also share power, and they empower others to create shared dedication to and responsibility for making the university what it should be. Heifetz described a similar kind of leadership approach when talking about adaptive leaders. Adaptive leaders frame key questions and key issues for their organizations, and they acknowledge external threats. They ask relevant questions and engage in holistic thinking. Adaptive leaders, much like Dumestra's transformational leaders, break down organizational silos. They encourage people to think outside their current roles, and they also encourage people to challenge norms. They model challenging status quo by examining multiple perspectives themselves. In conclusion, changing placement practices will require institutions to rethink traditional structures, but that change must be rooted in purpose to gain buy-in. Leaders can frame the placement issue as an opportunity to create a promising future. Through adaptive and transformational approaches, leaders will also show genuine interest and convincing optimism about possibilities for a more equitable and a more inclusive future for higher education overall.